Chuoine Uisle, tá bóta romh go léir hiag leabhar le náisiúnta na hÉireann. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2024 Joseph Hassett Lecture here at the National Library of Ireland. This evening marks a very important annual tradition for us, celebrating the legacy of one of Ireland's greatest poets, obviously, William Butler Yeats. And the first lecture in this series of annual lectures took place back in 2013, which is hard to believe, so 11 years ago. And we are delighted to host this event for the very first time in our wonderful new Jolie Lecture Theatre, which opened here in May of this year. I'd just like to draw your attention to the nearest exits, especially to my right-hand side, at the risk of sounding like I'm working for Aer Lingus or Ryanair, but very important nonetheless. And each year, with the generous and sincerely generous support of Dr. Joe Hassett, we come together to reflect on Yeats's enduring influence. And Dr. Hassett is not only a lawyer and philanthropist, but also an immense literary scholar with a deep connection to Yeats's work. Joe is unfortunately unable to join us tonight in person, but he's listening at home in Washington, DC, and we send our love to Dr. Hassett. Joe is a great friend of the National Library of Ireland and a champion of the Irish arts and culture in general, and this was recognised in 2022 when he received the Distinguished Presidential Service Award from Uachtaráin na hÉireann President Michael D. Higgins for his contributions to Irish culture and Irish literature. Tonight's lecture is inspired by our exhibition, The Life and Works of William Butler Yeats, which showcases the world's largest collection of Yeats material. And this year we are absolutely thrilled and honoured to have Belinda McKeon deliver the lecture Yeats and the Objects of Home. Belinda is an acclaimed novelist, playwright and short story writer, and her novels Solace and Tender have earned her critical acclaim and awards, including the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize and the Irish Book of the Year Award. Belinda has also been published in outlets such as the Paris Review and The Stinging Fly. Her plays have been produced both in Dublin and New York, and she is also Associate Professor of Creative Writing at Maynooth University, where she directs the Master of Arts in Creative Writing. So not only is she has a legacy in her own right as an acclaimed writer, but is obviously looking at the next generation of contemporary writers in Ireland, so a massive contribution to Irish life. So please join me in welcoming Belinda McKeon to deliver the 2024 Joseph Hassett Lecture, Yeats and the Objects of Home.
Thank you so much, Audrey. It's lovely to be here this evening. Thank you all for being here. And I'd like to say a huge thanks to Joe. And I've just noticed that I left my first page over there. So I'm going to just be here somewhere. I'll find it. I'll make it up. I'd like to say a massive thanks to Joe for sponsoring this lecture series. And I want to start, and I do have to, excuse me, something like this always happens when I'm giving a lecture, but there we go, we have it. I want to start by making a reference to Joe's PhD thesis on Yeats from 1984, when he submitted his PhD to UCD. The title was Enlarging Irish Hate, the Objects and Uses of Yeatsian Hate. Hate, he said, is Yeats's passion of preference. The letters and essays bristle with a hatred that is never far beneath the taut surface of his poetry. I'm going to start with something that Yeats at 19 hated, which was the house that his father had rented that year, 1884, in Terranure. Yeats hated this house. He hated the red bricks, made pretentious and vulgar with streaks of slate colour. He had his own room, which perhaps he did not hate, but he hated the fact that the neighbours across the road could clearly see through his window from their own, and that they watched him with derision as he acted out what he was writing and speaking. He hated that his absent-mindedness, his habits of doing things without knowing what he was doing, seemed inevitably to attract gossip and attention from the people on the streets about the place, like policemen, like tramway conductors. He hated that his father, the artist John Butler Yeats, could be quizzed en route to his studio by their landlord about the good of poetry, and that his father could find this funny. The young Yeats did not find this funny. It was not amusing to him that the only poet of whom these people knew was an old white-haired man in the locality who had written volumes of easy, too-honeyed verse, who had lost his mind and gone through his money, and now lived in a shabby neighbourhood of tenement houses with hens and chickens among the cobbled streets. He was known to live, this old poet, in one room, in a fantasy of his own creation. With a hammer, he had fixed a nail to the middle of the ceiling, from which innumerable cords were stretched to other nails in the walls. In this way, Yeats would later write, he kept up an illusion that he was living under canvas in some Arabian desert. The idea of this seems to have horrified the young Yeats, but at the same time there was a twinge of something like envy. At least this mad ancient poet had his privacy, his own, if only in an imagined sense, impenetrable space. Yeats could not escape like this old man from house and neighbourhood, but hated both, hearing every whisper, noticing every passing glance. This house at 10 Ashfield Terrace, which is now 418 Harold's Cross Road, and actually when I Googled this house, what I found was an eviction notice from about 5 years ago, was not Yeats's childhood home, or his adolescent home, or even the home he had lived in when he had turned 18. You'll know, I'm sure, that it was just one of many houses in which John Butler Yeats installed his family between the mid-1860s and the 1890s. This was, in fact, their 7th house, not counting the long, sometimes very long, stays with the Pollexfen grandparents in Sligo, to which their peripatetic existence as the children of an artist had brought the family. In their previous house in Howth, as Yeats wrote to Ethel Vesey, the elder sister of a school friend from school in Hammersmith and a friend of Lolly Yeats, the poet's sister, in a letter that summer of 1884, he said at least in that house in Howth they'd had a view of the sea and of much heather, and at times could say, there goes a grey gull, let verse be as spontaneous as the flight of a grey gull over the bay. But here from my window, he wrote, I see a straight wall, and by much stretching around the corner, the glimpse of a bush, very dim and dusty, a lamentable view for a maker of verses. For a maker of verses he was, and considered himself by this time, and though containing in George Bornstein's words many false starts and derivative echoes, the published and unpublished poems we still have from those years when Yeats was on the cusp of and turning 20 already contain some of the themes of his mature work. The outcast and his worth, for instance, in this short, unpublished poem, written a month or so after moving into Ashfield Terrace. Behold the man, with its call to attention, for he, with his brow of care, who sought to stay the living and the dead, who sought for more than all the nations with their famous lore of love, alone a sad forsaken strength. The seeking was not successful, so the seeker, sighing, rose and took his way at length, in rage inhuman, cursing the red bricks and their vulgar streaks of slate as he went around that dim and dusty bush, no doubt. But it was during this time in the young Yeats's life that a glimpse of a different kind of life, a different way of inhabiting a home and of living, made a forceful impression on him. He was taken along on his father's visits to the poet and critic and professor of English literature at Trinity College Dublin, Edward Dowden. In Dowden's house at 50 Wellington Road in Ballsbridge, John Butler Yeats, who would have preferred to see his son at Trinity as a student rather than at the Metropolitan School of Art in Kildare Street, pushed his son to read out loud some of his poems. The response was encouraging, if not overpraising. But what seems to have encouraged Yeats to a greater degree was the way in which the older poet lived. No hammered together imaginary yurts here, but rather, quote, an orderly, prosperous house where all was in good taste, where poetry was highly valued. It made Dublin tolerable for a while, Yeats remembered years later, and made Dowden, for a couple of years, an image of romance for the young poet. Except it did not last even a couple of years, that image of romance, because very soon in that same period, Yeats was introduced to another older poet whose home, whose manner of living would turn his head all over again, the Fenian John O'Leary, who lived with his sister Ellen in a house in Rathmines. The O'Leary house at 40 Leinster Road was the young Yeats's introduction to a concept which would become central to his own way of living as a poet a decade later in London, the at-home evening, the practice of regularly receiving and hosting a gathering of writers, artists, and intellectuals in the sitting room or parlour, tea and whiskey and no dress, as he came to write to his friend Ernest Rhys in 1896, Or to his Golden Dawn friend, Dorothea Hunter, in 1898, come a little before the others, and don't dress, of course. At Shea O'Leary's on Leinster Road, dressing for drinks was a distinctly unlikely prospect. What Yeats remembered of the house was a disordered chaos, quote, full of books, always second-hand copies that had often been ugly and badly printed when new, and had not grown to my unhistoric mind more pleasing from the dirt of some old Dublin bookshop. O'Leary piled books upon him, books which, as we'll come to in a moment, would change Yeats's idea of poetry. While Dowden had also given him books, it was in John O'Leary's rooms, bursting with books, that Yeats now saw the life of an artist, and beside it, Dowden's ironical calm, he said later, came to seem but a professional pose. Now, from this disordered chaos of books, Yeats found something which would be crucial to him and which was linked for him to a notion of taste and beauty, the Irish poets who had written in English, and the need for new poetry, which would be distinguished and lonely, as he told a college student one night walking in Dublin. Yeats wanted something of both Old Ireland and Protestant order. He began to think about how one might seal with the right image the soft wax before it began to harden. He sought a combination. If Irish Catholics did not have the good taste, the household courtesy and decency of the Protestant Ireland he had known, and if Protestant Ireland thought of nothing but getting on, success, property, respectability, he thought it was possible to bring the halves together in a national literature that made Ireland beautiful in the memory, and yet had been freed from provincialism by a European pose. Interestingly, when years later he recalled this idea, Yeats would write that it was because of this, as he called it, dream, that when his father moved the family back to London once again to house number 8, which was at 3 Blenheim Road in the Bedford Park neighbourhood, Yeats, made with pastels upon the ceiling of my study a map of Sligo, decorated like an old map with a ship and an elaborate compass. Actually, while the family moved to that Bedford Park house in 1887, it was not until early summer 1889 that the Yeats brothers, for the painter Jack was in on the project as well, painted the ceiling of the poet's study in advance of a visit from the poet's friend, Catherine Tynan. He was adding, indeed, to an existing ceiling painting of the Zodiac, which he had created himself. I find it interesting that Yeats remembered this transformative shift in the idea of what poetry might be and what Irish poetry should become, as taking expression not just in his own poetry or his thoughts on poetry, but on the way in which he described his surroundings as a young poet, the way in which he decorated his surroundings as a young poet. In fact, Jack B. Yeats' scribbling diary from 1889, which was until 2017 in the ownership of the Yeats family, and because of this could be seen and read by scholars, including John Kelly. Kelly, in his footnote to the 1889 letter in which William tells Catherine Tynan that he and Jack have set to work on the ceiling mural, Kelly notes that Jack's scribbling diary for May 1889 announces, "Willie and I did his ceiling," with the entry accompanied by a sketch of the poet brother, then almost 24, precariously perched on a pile of furniture, painting the ceiling blue and splattering himself on the rest of the room in the attempt, while the artist brother, who would then have been aged 18, attempts to shelter behind another pile of furniture. The scribbling diary was sold at the Sotheby's auction, the Yeats family auction, in 2017 for £17,000. And I've tried to find out where it went, but none of the major public institutions seem to have acquired it, although our own National Gallery owns many other Jack B. Yeats sketches showing the Yeats homes at various periods. But we can deduce, I think, from these Jack B. Yeats sketches from the first page of that 1889 scribbling diary, the style in which this funny little visual record of an early Yeats brothers collaboration might have taken. There's the same blue, perhaps, in those trousers with which the ceiling and everything else was splashed in a dream of Ireland, beautiful in the memory, but in a European pose. But more on this shortly. I want to underline first what has been eloquently underlined by many Yeatsians, including Terence Brown, which is that the housing precarity, which was the lived experience of the Yeats brothers and sisters for their entire childhood and adolescence, the fact that there was, for those years, no Yeats house for memory and legend to mythologize, only a series of addresses, in Brown's words, inevitably shaped the identity and the art of these four siblings. As Roy Foster has put it, they were precocious, talented, and knowledgeable about insecurity, both social and psychological. I would add that their sense of precarity and insecurity can only have been deepened by the loss of two younger siblings, one an infant and one a 4-year-old boy, and the painful depression into which their mother, Susan, sank for the bulk of her later years. She had married a barrister and ended up a wife to an often penniless artist, the same person, I should add. Her son would remember her years later as a woman whose sense of personality, her desire for any life of her own, had disappeared in her care for us and in much anxiety about money. It was that series of addresses, so much in contrast, as Brown points out, to the Anglo-Irish notion of the house as a measure of social standing and of how well life was being lived, which put its imprint in the soft wax before it hardened, so to speak. I'm going to try this evening to add to the idea that what home looked like and the extent to which he could consider it his own mattered deeply to W.B. Yeats. It mattered to him from a young age. As a teenager, when he went out to Lambay Island with a friend, he thought, I would like to live here always, and perhaps someday I will. He remembered in reveries, always discovering places where I would like to spend my whole life. Having a room, having spaces of one's own to make one's own, was becoming something the young Yeats was thinking about. He was becoming conscious of the fact that at Ashfield Terrace, he did not have this. He had not really had it anywhere. And when a child does not have a space of their own, neither probably does that child have things of their own, possessions, objects onto which they can project their growing personality, their dreams, their notions of what life is and will be. And while it was hardly unusual for children of the period, even children descended from the aristocratic butlers, to have to make do, to play with homemade toys, or to play with shadows, as the Yeats children did in their shadow plays, or to play chess, as they also did in the dust of the road, or on holiday, to play with stones made up as dolls, their faces painted by Jack. But it is, I think, notable that even the Yeats children's toys, the things of childhood which we know about from the poet's letters and memoirs, were imbued with the feeling of their lived precarity. A doll, for instance, was named after a tenant whose refusal to pay rent in what was left of their father's Kildare estate had a direct impact on William and his siblings. They knew that in a month in which this tenant did not pay her rent, there would be less money in their own home, and the doll with the tenant's name became a container for their resultant distress and anger, being physically punished by the children. As many children do, in the face of this precarity, Yeats began to gather things to himself. As a teenager, he would have an interest in entomology, but as a younger boy, dreaming of being a ship captain and building his own ship, he collected little pieces of wood and piled them up in a corner of the yard. And he would often visit an old rotten log in the corner of a field, in a distant field, because this log seemed perfect for the making of his ship. Collecting things in this way gave to the boy, as it does to so many people who collect, a certain sense of security. He wrote later, "When I had gathered pieces of wood in the corner for my great ship, I was confident that I could keep calm among the storms and die fighting when the great battle came." A psychoanalyst would not need to spend long puzzling over that projection, and indeed Yeats himself, years later, would use the term symptom to describe what he was doing when he hoarded those pieces of wood. "I was nursing my own dream," he would write, connecting the collection of pieces of wood with a later collection, a set of fantasies about courage and achievement which were fed by his fascination as a schoolboy of 15 with an American athlete. The American athlete, by the way, was Lawrence Eugene, or Lon Myers, and the quote he relished about the American runner he mentions, that he was the bright particular star of American athletes, can be seen in this 1818 issue of the boy's own paper. "I was nursing my own dream, my form of the common schoolboy dream, though I was no longer gathering the little pieces of broken and rotting wood. Often, instead of learning my lesson, I covered the white squares of my chessboard on my little table with pen and ink pictures of myself, doing all sorts of courageous things." Now, it wasn't that the boy Yeats did not have examples of collections from his older relatives. In Sligo, his seafaring grandfather, William Pollexfen, had amassed some acquisitions from his travels in a cabinet in the dining room. In here were bits of coral and a jar of water from the Jordan for the baptizing of his children, and Chinese pictures upon rice paper, and an ivory walking stick from India that came to me after his death. This all from Yeats's autobiography. In a cottage nearby, meanwhile, Sea View, where his father's great-aunt Mary, or Mickey Yeats, lived and farmed, was another clutch of objects, relics, which made an impact on the boy. She was full of family history, Yeats would recall. All her dinner knives were pointed like daggers through much cleaning, and there was a little James I cream jug with the Yeats motto, and on her dining room mantelpiece a beautiful silver cup that had belonged to my there possibly is another great-grandfather, who had married a certain Mary Butler. It had upon it the Butler crest and had already been old, he wrote, at the date 1534. All its history for generations was rolled up inside it upon a piece of paper yellow with age, until some caller took the paper to light his pipe. So we see that the young Yeats noticed things and treasured things and remembered them. And this was in part because these things had been noticed and treasured and remembered by those before him. Not that there was a hushed reverence about that remembrance. This image of the caller taking the yellowed family history to light a pipe has an echo in Yeats's observation in the same section of Reveries that in another kind of family, a county family, he means meaning a more properly Anglo-Irish family, not townies like his family, the knowledge of a certain general in the family history would consist of legend rather than just an anecdote about boiled pork as it did for them. Collecting, whether it be pieces of wood or bugs or later stories, was for Yeats a way of nursing a dream. The choice of nursing seems significant, a sense of nurturing, an image of a nursery garden or a room in which children can play in a safe and solid sense of attachment. Yeats, his memoirs tell us, was a sad little boy, so much so that at moments he felt the desire to die. Reflecting on this in 1914, he wrote that there was no reason for his unhappiness. Nobody was unkind, he said, and my grandfather has still, after so many years, my gratitude and reverence. The house, he means the grandfather's house in Sligo, was so big that there was always a room to hide in. It's a striking image, not a room to play in, but a room to hide in. The further away he got from that time, he recalled, the less unhappy he felt. I have grown happier with every year of life, as though gradually conquering something in myself. Yeats's relationship to the things he came to collect and possess, I would argue, and his relationship to his own ability as he grew older, as he came into independence and into spaces and furnishings and belongings of his own, was a key part of that conquering. But it also came to comprise a tense counterpoint to the values and beliefs he would nurse and nurture as an artist. Values which were in opposition to materialism, commercialism, middle-class getting along, the rag and bone shop of the heart, but also of the streets, little and otherwise. And I talk now not just of the boy of 12 who, living in Holland Park in London, looking in the windows of toy shops and sweet shops and missing the landscape of Sligo intensely, found himself close to tears and longing for a sod of earth from the landscape of Sligo, from some field he knew, something of Sligo to hold in my hand. But I'm thinking of the poet in his 20s and 30s and beyond, who would come to see objects, items of clothing, of furniture, of decoration and ornament, as containers and expressions of meaning and of identity, as talismans, and not just in the sense in which he would value and create and value talismans as part of his dabblings in the occult. Some of these talismans, by the way, are on display in the Yeats exhibition next door, the ones he made himself. Objects and possessions would, throughout Yeats's life, come to comprise and confer so much extra estate, to borrow the phrase he used in 1922 to describe to his friend Lady Gregory the house he had just bought with a mortgage at 82 Merrion Square. By then, he also owned the Tower at Thorballallee near Gurt, and had filled it with furniture designed by the architect William Scott and made by a local carpenter, Patrick Connolly, objects heavily influenced by the arts and crafts movement, including this bed. Scott also designed a table, which was never ultimately made, but the great trestle table seen at the right here, Yeats wrote to his father, was kept covered with wild flowers by Yeats's wife, George. He had plans in that same letter for a great copper hanging lantern in the thatched hall. The curtains in the tower were of roughly hewn cloth, dyed vivid colours, the window frames were painted red and the ceiling blue. The chairs were reproductions of the traditional Sligo or tomb chair, here the three-legged. Yeats wrote to Maud Gonne that he hoped the tower would be a house that may, quote, encourage people to avoid ugly manufactured things, except a few important things imported as models. We should get all made in Galway or Limerick. I am told that our neighbours are pleased that we are not getting grand things, but old Irish furniture. We see that same vision in the poem, A Prayer on Going Into My House. God, grant a blessing on this tower and cottage. Sorry about the line break there. That cottage should be on the same line. And on my heirs, of all remain unspoiled. No table or chair or stool not simple enough for shepherd lads in Galilee. And grant that I myself for portions of the year may handle nothing and set eyes on nothing, but what the great and passionate have used throughout so many varying centuries. Meanwhile, for the Merrion Square house he would buy with his Nobel Prize money, a Regency dining table, mahogany and ebony strung, and a half-moon cabinet. Also 6 early 19th century spindleback dining chairs of ash and rush. There would be his writing bureau, oak cross-banded with mahogany from 1770 or thereabouts, the fall opening, the drop opening to reveal a green baize writing surface, 8 pigeonholes, 7 small drawers and 4 concealed compartments arranged around a central cupboard. In March 1922, as he and George prepared to move in, Yeats wrote to Lady Gregory that they would have enough furniture, but their carpets would look like postage stamps in the big rooms. I suppose carpets will be our first extravagance, he continued. I think constantly that our children will have that spacious home I lacked after I left Sligo. Their current home in Oxford, he said in that letter, was beautiful, both house and what we have done with it. And George thinks the new house will be more handsome and even fit our furniture better. In a postscript, he then added, Abby seems to do badly. Is it losing money? But Lady Gregory was by no means unaccustomed to letters from Yeats, which chattered on about matters of furniture or household fittings, alongside questions of national or cultural urgency. In a letter from April 1916, he briefly mentioned the Easter Rising, which was then breaking news, a tragic business, he wrote, that will leave Ireland different for a long time. Before getting to the real purpose of this letter, I write chiefly to say that the money, that is the money Lady Gregory had sent him for the bathroom improvements in his flat, came safely. I have ordered the bath. Now, in fairness, it was not yet clear to Yeats quite how devastating the events in Dublin had been that Easter Monday. But what these moments from his later years show, I think, is that his early experience of precarity fundamentally shaped his sense of what was his and of what he could consider his own. In such an atmosphere, objects become imbued with meaning, with a vision of what the self might be and might possess, not just in terms of things, but in the contents of his own mind. I developed late, Yeats told Horace Reynolds in 1932. For a long time, I had trouble in selecting the ideas that belonged to me. Now, an interlude and a confession of sorts. I came to this task and to the delight of writing this lecture, not as a Yeatsian, but as a thrifter, as someone who's never happier than in a junk store or an antique shop, who could spend hours hyperfixating on the tiniest details of a lamp or a table or a piece of clothing from the past. My fascination with the objects in the Sotheby's and Fonzie Mealy auctions from 2017, the London and Kilkenny auction houses, respectively, is definitely of the dubious quality, pointed up so gently but forcefully as a fascination with, quote, relics bringing writing agency to life, or, quote, items seemingly stamped with an aura of unshakable associations, by Warwick Gould in The Poetry of the Thing Outlived, his analysis of those auctions after the fact, which was published in the Yeats Annual 21 in 2018. I believe he was indebted to Joe for that title, which is in itself a quote from Henry James's The Aspirin Papers, The Poetry of the Thing Outlived. Gould notes in that essay that, quote, now that the materiality of writing and even of drawing is vanishing, museums of writing seek to preserve not merely Sumerian tablets, ancient manuscripts, and calligraphic tools, but also typewriters and word processors. The objects in this sale preserve something not always found in such museums, particularity of ownership, the perpetually vital ingredient of human agency. A known and valued creator, we say, lived and worked using or surrounded by these objects. The mana, the life force held in the object, has market value, and it's not always effaced when transferred as relic value into new ownership, end quote. I'll say that yes, there is a madness in this, thinking about the objects of a poet to this extent, using my thrifting mentality to stare as if at a painting at the photographs of Yeats in his places of residence, the rooms in which he lived, as they remain to us in photographs, and noticing, hyperfixating, thinking. The fruits of some of this hyperfixation I will share with you. For instance, these pieces of coral, those pieces of coral which were in the cabinet at his grandfather's house, among the things brought back from his grandfather's travels, could they have been these pieces of coral included in a jumbo lot in the Fonsimile auction in 2017? Or was that coral among the things affected in 1892 when Yeats's grandfather was on his deathbed, and, to quote Yeats, old servants of that house where there had never been noise or disorder began to pilfer, and after his death there was a quarrel over the disposition of certain mantelpiece ornaments of no value. One thing that seems sure is that one of the little sketches in this book by John Butler Yeats is of the sitting room at Seaview, Sligo, which was in fact Mickey Yeats's house. This is her sitting room, where the young Yeats admired and made relics out of these ancient family things. Another thing that I think seems sure is that lot 626 in that same sale, described as a group of 8 watercolour flower studies in Victorian style by Elizabeth Pollexfen, Yeats's maternal grandmother, were indeed not intended, as the auction catalogue suggests they were, as place markers, a domestic utilitarian function which seems framed to excuse art from a woman's hand because it might serve, after all, a function in a woman's real work of laying the dinner table, but were actually those pictures of his grandmother called to mind by Yeats years later. This is the auction description of the items, a group of 8 watercolours, flower studies possibly intended as placeholders, but were in fact those pictures of his grandmother called to mind by Yeats years later when he recalled how, as a true lover of her garden, she had, before the care of her house had grown upon her, chose some favourites among her flowers, or she would choose some favourite among her flowers and copy it onto rice paper. I think these are those pictures. One more from this delight to use Henry James's phrase in a palpable, imaginable, visible past. This sketchbook from the Fonsimile sale, is this Yeats's drawing of the Discobolus, polished up by his father, who was intent on making the shoulder stand out, quote, with swift and broken lines? I think it might be. Now, we know that Yeats's father's influence on Yeats was intense, but Yeats felt differently to his father about art, for instance, during those years when he was an art student in Dublin. I did not care for reality and believed that creation should be conscious, he wrote in Reveries, and yet I could only imitate my father. The realism in which John Butler Yeats dealt as a painter by then, painting portraits of Dublin people, noble and otherwise, was already hateful to the young Yeats. In my heart, he wrote, I thought that only beautiful things should be painted, and that only ancient things and the stuff of dreams were beautiful. And I almost quarrelled with my father when he made a large watercolour of a consumptive beggar girl. It was too much realism. Later, in fact, their difference over what was meaningful, the stuff of the real world or the stuff of dreams, the merely seen or the purely imagined, would come to more than an almost quarrel, when Yeats Sr. would break a picture frame over his son's head during an argument about Ruskin, which must, given the recency of the Ruskin-Whistler trial at the time, have at its core have been another argument about what the artist should and should not paint or pursue as his subject. This tension, which brought father and son to blows, the tension between reality and imagination, was the tension out of which Yeats created his art. To him, even as a very young man, realism in art was vulgar, depressing, not worthy of pursuit. But in the young poet's daily life, as they would in the older poet's daily life, objects, beautiful objects, covetable objects, objects which were pleasurable to collect and behold and with which to be surrounded, did hold importance in ways in which, from this early stage, rubbed inconveniently up against Yeats's abhorrence of materialism and of the fabric of everyday life. When John Butler Yeats moved his young family to the Bedford Park neighbourhood for the first time in 1879, the new development of Queen Anne-style houses, designed largely by Norman Shaw and with interiors by William Morris, the teenage Yeats and his siblings found the place a romantic excitement. We were to see De Morgan tiles, peacock blue doors, and the pomegranate pattern, and the tulip pattern of Morris, and to discover that we had always hated doors painted with imitation grain and the roses of mid-Victoria and tiles covered with geometrical patterns. The streets were not straight and dull, but wound about. The commercial builder had not begun to copy and to cheapen. My two sisters and my brother and myself, he wrote, had dancing lessons in a low, red brick and tiled house that drove away dreams of one day living in a house made exactly like a ship's cabin. He remembered this house having a dining room table painted peacock blue. The woodwork also was all peacock blue. And upstairs there was a window niche so big and high up there was a flight of steps to go up and down by, and a table in the niche. The two sisters, he remembered, of the master of this house were his teachers in dance, and the master of this house was a well-known pre-Raphaelite painter. And they and their old mother, that meaning the sisters and the mother, were dressed in peacock blue, in dresses so simply cut that they seemed a part of every story. It's been suggested that the painter mentioned here by Yeats was the Bedford Park resident at the time, the painter E.M. Rook. But I think there's reason to suspect or to suggest that it might be another painter who at this time, 1880 or so, was not yet renowned as a pre-Raphaelite, but would come to be over his long and prolific career, Edmund Blair Leighton, who lived with his mother and his sisters, three women who had recently closed up their school for girls, which offered classes including dancing in Notting Hill, and who now lived with the painter in his house in Bedford Park. Commentary on Leighton's art from these years, which consisted of entries to the annual Royal Academy show, but also of illustrations for Christmas cards, remark on the particular realism and detail of his clothing and props in his works, suggesting that he was already, as a painter, immersed in the practice documented in his mature studio practice, that is, of dressing the women in his family up in period costumes of rich colors and using them as models for his portraits of medieval or classical scenes. Yeats, in the same passage of memoir, recalls that he looked with delight at the painter's mother, the old woman in that house, costumed in peacock blue, but that his father, in disgust, muttered, "Imagine dressing your old mother up like that." This, by the way, was the house on Woodstock Road where they lived. And this is a postcard from that period. The Yeats house would have been the third house on the right, identical to this one with the two windows, the dormer windows. And here, just quickly, are some of Edmund Blair Leighton's paintings with the old woman who appears frequently and seems to have been used as a model. That color of peacock blue also appears very frequently in Leighton's work, and the red brick of what may have been Bedford Park houses. In fact, the peacock blue color appears in everything from dresses to panels to watering cans. Window niches also feature. This is a sidebar, not to mention a speculation. These are some of the paintings from that particular period, 1881 or thereabouts. But it is intriguing to imagine the young Yeats visiting and absorbing the practice of an artist who collected and valued objects in this way. An artist, indeed, who would, during those years, see the initial critical acclaim for his paintings of medieval scenes turn to mockery of the over-realism of his detail. His attention to the detail of objects like armors and the draping of fabric was, one critic chided, only the means by which greatness in art can be attained to, not greatness itself. Now, the house at 8 Woodstock Road, where the Yeatses lived from 1879 to 1881, was large and elegant. A feature in Harper's Monthly Magazine at the time argued that it was a masterstroke as a housing development because of the way it provided an answer to the conundrum that people who most desired beautiful homes were those of the younger generation, in whom the new culture had educated above the mere pursuit of riches, at the same time awakening in them refined tastes which only through riches could obtain their satisfaction. So they were educated above the mere pursuit of riches, but they could only have the beautiful things they wanted through pursuit of riches. Yeats would carry this conundrum far beyond his years in Bedford Park, but those years in Woodstock Road, Bedford Park, awakened something, a pleasure in place that was not just about nature. Back in Dublin from 1881 to 1886, where the family lived in Howth and then at the hated house on Ashfield Terrace, he began to collect again. Bugs. He went around with his green net. Stories. He noticed how his mother would listen to the fishermen's wives. And when he grew out of collecting bugs, he still went out at night and slept in a cave by the sea. And still, he remembered years later, noticed all the past, how the little moths came out at sunset, and how after that there were only a few big moths until dawn brought little moths again, and what birds cried out at night as if in their sleep. In Sligo, staying with his uncle, the young Yeats would go out at night, meaning to sleep in the woods opposite in Ashfree. I could watch my island in early dawn, he wrote in Reveries, and notice the order of the cries of the birds. What the young Yeats was learning to do on these adventures in Sligo and Howth was more than just noticing what birds sang at what point of the dawn. He was noticing, he was processing, he was internalizing by listening to the order of the bird's song, practices of cadence, organization, and composition which would feed into his practice as a poet. Ordering and collecting would lead directly to his way, his ability, his instinct for arranging words and rhythms in a line and in a stanza. And when the Yeats moved back to Bedford Park in 1888, this time to this house on Blenheim Road, the Yeats who joined them was, at 23, a published poet and playwright, an organizer and presider and attender of meetings and societies, and a man who therefore could command his own study at the back of the house. Now, this is a real estate listing for the house next door, the twin of 3 Blenheim Road. This is 5 Blenheim Road. So what we see here is the same house, essentially. That would have been the equivalent of Yeats's balcony. Yeats's balcony is to the far left. This was the little room in the next door house, which opened to the balcony, and so this would have been the ceiling. I'm just going to move on to Yeats wrote plenty during these Blenheim years, and by his last summer in the family home, before he moved into his own rooms, he was taking delivery of the beautiful object that was the first copy of his first collection, Poems, published by T. Fisher Unwin. His sister Lily remembered him sitting with it, turning it over and over, staring at it. This is also the period during which he wrote his novel, John Sherman, the story of a young man struggling to decide between 2 paths in life. His choice is between the free life of poetry and the life of London, where everything is owned by too many to be owned by anyone. In London, he could have a fine house, a garden, 3 gardeners. But then, like his anti-self character, the Reverend William Howard, he would be the reverse of poetical, for poetry is essentially a touch from behind the curtain. That's a line from John Sherman. The problem is that to have the touch from behind the curtain, it is still necessary to have the curtain, which is where Lady Gregory comes in. My dear Joyce, I have just heard from Lady Gregory about your plan of going to Paris to study. It seems that you leave Dublin Monday night and cross to Paris Tuesday night. If I am right, I hope you will breakfast with me on Tuesday morning. I shall set my alarm clock and be ready for you as soon as the train gets in. You can lie down on my sofa afterwards and sleep off the fatigue of the journey. You can dine with me and catch your Paris train afterwards. I hope you will come to me. I shall like good talk. From London in November 1902, learning that the young writer he had recently met in Dublin was now on his way to Paris, Yeats invited that young writer to sleep on his sofa in the interval between crossings. It would be their second meeting. Their first had taken place by chance in the street in Dublin, with Yeats then asking the younger man to tea nearby. There had ensued a mini lecture by Yeats, who paced up and down, expounding his philosophy of how ideas were inferior to images, the folk and the country superior to the town and to derivative modes of thought. In the towns, he informed the 20-year-old Joyce, especially in big towns like London, you don't find what old writers used to call the people. You find instead a few highly cultivated, highly perfected individual lives and great multitudes who imitate them and cheapen them. Joyce responded curtly with a remark on the uselessness of generalizations and got up to leave. Still, only a few weeks later, he was in Yeats's London rooms in this building at Woburn Buildings, likely enduring a continuation of the dissertation on art and the spirit, and likely looking askance at what we know now to have been by then at what we know to have been by then Yeats's objects of decor in his rooms there in Woburn Buildings near the British Library, as seen in this photograph from roughly the same period. A cast, the white thing there on the back, of Dante's death mask, a corner cupboard, his bookshelves, a tall Paschal candle, his travel shrine, and several prints of Blake engravings. He might have seen some of the other interior features mentioned in Yeats' letters from that period: the slate on which he wrote his engagements, the range on which he cooked in a primitive manner. Lady Gregory tended to bring her own sandwiches when she visited him. The dark divan that would probably be the sofa offered to Joyce. He would see the fire, which Lady Gregory had once and probably more than once fretted was not made up by his landlady, but he had to be made up by the poet himself, even on the coldest mornings. He would also see the blue curtains, which Lady Gregory had purchased for him in Harvey Nichols in 1897, and very likely also this watercolour, which she had purchased for him by his brother, Jack, Memory Harbour. And he would probably also have seen, and maybe even have spent that second lecture slumped in the large leather chair, also a gift from Lady Gregory, which had shown up also around 1900 in this draft poem about a visit from Maud Gonne. We know that whatever the lecture topic of the day might have been, Yeats does seem to have influenced the younger writer, Joyce. When Joyce arrived in Paris a few days later, he wrote to his family to let them know he had arrived, he was settling, and had bought an alarm clock, 4 francs, to waken him in the morning. He was also thinking about furniture. There is magnificent Norman furniture, that's not how Joyce sounded, but there is magnificent Norman furniture in a shop here, heavy wooden presses with panelled doors, £5 for one, about twice as big as your wardrobe, and though I cannot buy these yet for my room, I shall certainly get them as soon as I can, he wrote. But if the older writer seemed comfortably, even luxuriously set up to the younger writer, 2 years later, Joyce would mock Yeats in his poem, his satirical poem, The Holy Office, as one who whinges over gold-embroidered fringes. It was hardly really the case, although by late 1902, Yeats was well established as a writer and intellectual presence. The apartment in Woburn Buildings had been home for 6 years. He wrote to his friend Charles Elkin Matthews that he was busy in 1896 bringing furniture to his new rooms. Arthur Symonds, his friend from Dublin, concerned that he was involved with the journalists and writers creating the Savoy magazine, told him to clear out of Arthur Symonds' vicinity and to come back to Dublin. It would be better for you morally. But he did not clear out. He moved in. Firstly, he moved into Symonds' flat, and later into his own rooms, which we see here in Woburn Buildings. He took the opportunity for a room of his own, walls of his own, space of his own, and a double bed of his own, for which famously he went on what sounds to have been an incredibly cringe-making shopping expedition with his lover then, Olivia Shakespeare. I remember an embarrassed conversation in the presence of some Tottenham Court shopman upon the width of the bed. Every inch increased the expense. Shakespeare came with him to make every purchase like a newlywed blitzing through a registry list, although she had by then been married some 11 years, though who's counting? Actually, Mrs. Old, Yeats's housekeeper was, she helped Symonds to tot up the value of the items that Yeats had taken to Woburn Buildings from the previous rooms. 1 bedstead, mattress, bolster, pillow, 1 table, 7 pieces of tapestry canvas, 2 pieces of plushette, 2 blankets. Yeats, we're told by Foster, sent to Dublin for the few belongings he had kept there and searched for cheap furniture in London. In his memoirs, Yeats would recall this process of finding furnishings that he would throw away without regret as he grew more prosperous. There's a funny anecdote about him trying to get books sent over from Dublin to London by his friend John Quinn. Those books were chased by Quinn and Edmund Russell without success. It seems that the lodgings in Dublin had been broken up. Russell wrote to Quinn, "A plague on all poets. They're a poor, moon-struck race with no practical common sense." And they gave up trying to find his books. What did come into Yeats's life that year was friendship with Lady Augusta Gregory. Gregory was helping Yeats to make Woburn Buildings more fully his own. During those first years there, he wrote to her often to thank her for things she had sent him: books, a pen, a pheasant for Christmas, port for a toothache, a subscription to the Daily Chronicle. Things she had left behind in Cool she sent to him, his Tatwa cards, which are also here in the exhibition. And in 1903, the shrine we see in this Tatler photograph. Finding it in Cool, Lady Gregory brought it on her next visit to him, but then absent-mindedly brought it home again. On undoing my hold all, I found that wretched shrine which I had brought up for you and which has now landed here again. Was Yeats uneasy with her attentiveness? About the curtains, he wrote to Lady Gregory a few days before her visit with the measurements she'd requested. I do not know that I should have measured that window at all. I have a kind of feeling that I ought not to let you do all these kind things for me, things that one should do for oneself. Yet it is a great pleasure to have these little kindnesses shown to one, altogether apart from the things themselves. I wish I saw clearly in the matter. I am in continual doubt about simple things. What Yeats expresses in this moment of doubt, it seems to be, is about more than just a curtain. In fact, to go back to the image from his novel, John Sherman, it's about the tension between the curtain, the luxurious item of home decor, of ornament and comfort, aesthetic signposting, and what John Sherman, his character in that novel, describes as poetry, the touch from behind the curtain. In that story, Rosa Alchemica, and I'll finish with this, published during that first spring of an independent, of independent living, published that spring in Savoy, Yeats presented a narrator surrounded in his Dublin home by rare and luxurious objects pervaded with the spirit of the 90s. Tapestries in blue and gold, bronze gods and goddesses, books bound in leather and stamped with intricate ornament, French carved panels, a peacock curtain, but who had collected these items in a bid to reach through them a world wholly of essences. He could not go any further, however, than the realm of aesthetic admiration. All his life, Yeats would, when denigrating what he considered cheap or shallow forms of expression or articulation, use the metaphor of the ornament or the pridefully owned or displayed object. When he wrote to Russell to let him know that he would dedicate The Secret Rose to him, he said that Ireland and its gift of vision could be contrasted with hurried and more successful nations because in Ireland, no shining candelabra has prevented us from looking into the darkness where the worthwhile things are to be seen. To George Moore in 1898, helpfully suggesting a passage of fiction for the character Moore had based on him in his novel, Yeats has that character tell his beloved that if she stays in London, she will be lost to a place where men have forgotten all except a lust for gold and the physical satisfactions that gold can buy. And when he criticized his own book, The Celtic Twilight, 40 years later, he would criticize it rather, as a bit of ornamental, trivial needlework. The Yeats who moved out of the family home in autumn 1895 into his own room was the young writer who had just published his first book of poems. Lily Yeats, his sister, remembers him sitting in the garden at Blenheim Road, looking at it, not reading it, just turning it over and over in his hands. This was a collection which had allowed him to reorder and refine his early work and to frame within it the values which he now knew he wanted his poetry to be about: pure beauty, old deep knowledge, the essence of things. Politics and the world, in Foster's word, were shunned. This shunning of realism, of materialism, built on the attitude out of which he had the previous year prefaced his anthology, A Book of Irish Verse, did not strike a genuine, in which he in his preface, he attacked poetry which did not strike a genuine Celtic note as artificial and mechanic. Such writers, the Young Ireland Society crowd, loved the mortal arts but shrank from the immortal. In his apartment at Woburn Buildings, he began to hold his evenings at home, his mini salons. Dorothy Richardson, who was his neighbour later in those years, remembered living across the way and seeing, quote, shadowy figures seated in high-backed antique chairs or standing clear in the window space, chiefly being talked to by the tall presiding figure, visible now here, now there, always in speech. One is reminded of the funny story told by Yeats's friend Catherine Tynan back in Dublin at a salon in her own home. She remembered gently taking a book of poetry from Yeats's hand when it became clear that he would not stop reading from it and talking about it to or at those about him. She replaced it on the bookcase behind a glass door and locked the glass door. By the late 1890s in London, Yeats was indeed a presiding figure, a literary personality, as pieces in The Sketch and The Gale by people including Tynan and Stephen McKenna would make clear. And I'll look briefly, at a piece by Stephen McKenna which talks about Yeats as that personality. These are just some sections about how he saw Yeats. Yeats is careful about his personal appearance and makes an elaborate toilette. But the toilette is spontaneous in his inspiration. He doesn't follow fashions mainly because he doesn't observe that there are fashions, or because observing them, he very rightly fails to see that they have any relation to himself. And after all, even if he does aim at being picturesque, what harm? Why not make himself as interesting as he makes his books? The worthy citizen who criticizes Yeats probably chose his own loud check suit and got his hair cut square on his hard commercial head because he thought the variegated, elegant tweed and the hair paired to the quick suited him best, by which analogy it may be seen that poets and prosy persons are alike in their ideal. It's only, McKenna wrote, in the results that the difference appears. One can only imagine the shudder with which this was read by Yeats, for whom the difference existed very much in the ideals as well as in the results. This was the tension which would drive his poetry that year, wishing for cloth to become the cloth of heaven, but needing for it in the real world also to be cloth, which could drape and dress and disguise for that year and for many years to come. Thank you.